Well, happy Tuesday, everybody. Pastor Steve here, and again, I'm so glad you've joined me for today's devotion. For this, whether you're watching the video or listening to the podcast. And by the way, won't you share it with others and encourage them, invite them to join us in this journey. Today we are in Luke chapter 16, and over the years of my ministry, I have preached from the stories and parables in this chapter many times. But today, I want to share with you, when I was reading this chapter, and I'm 66 years old now, when I was reading this, they kind of came together as one story, as one theme, as one unit, if you will, for me, in a way they had not previously. Just, I sort of knew it, but it just really jumped out at me more this time. And, you know, in the earlier part of the chapter, when Jesus tells the story, the parable about the very wealthy man who had an unrighteous or untrustworthy steward, and stewards were managers of a wealthy person's household. And he was going to be fired and had to give an account and all of that. And you remember he worked out a deal with his master's creditors to get some of what they owed paid, so he'd have something to give to his master, even if it wasn't the full amount that they owed. And the master was impressed by how shrewd he was, and he ended up saving his job. Now, I want you to notice what Jesus said in verses 8 and 9. He said, his master praised the unrighteous manager, the unrighteous steward, because he had acted shrewdly. It doesn't say he had acted ethically, but shrewdly. And then Jesus said, the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. That's always been an intriguing verse, where Jesus said the sons of this age, the people who are not following God, the people who are lost, you might say, in some ways are more shrewd when it comes to what matters to them, to what's important to them, to their lives in some sense, than those who are the sons of light, than God's children. And then he said in verse 9, I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. Now remember, the unethical steward or manager had gone to his master's debtors and settled the bill for less than they actually owed, in the hopes that if he lost his job because he had done them a favor, they would take care of him and receive him into their homes or to their company or their employment. And Jesus said that guy was shrewd, shrewder than many of you who follow me. I don't know, is shrewder a word, or should I just say more shrewd? Anyway. And then he said in verse 9 that we are to make friends for ourselves by means of unrighteous, the wealth of unrighteousness. I think the King James says by unrighteous mammon or something like that, I forget, so that they will receive you into eternal dwellings, heaven. It's interesting. What's he saying? Well, they were using money for selfish purposes. We are to use money for God's kingdom. And I think what Jesus is saying here is that we should be shrewd in how we use our money, so that in doing so, we're actually advancing the kingdom of God, the gospel evangelism, and that because of the ministries that we underwrite financially, because we're being shrewd with how we use what is actually God. You see, your money belongs to God. My money belongs to God. It doesn't belong to us. So be shrewd in how we use what we are managing for God, and do it in such a way that people are saved because of it, as a result of the ministries that we fund, so that when we get to heaven, they welcome us because we did something good for them, just like this unethical manager did something that benefited his master's debtors. We do something that benefits lost people, hurting people when we use our resources. Actually, they're God's resources, but in a way that brings them in. So that's what Jesus is saying here, and it's an interesting teaching. And then he goes on to, confront the Pharisees, because after this teaching, and if you want clarity on it, if you think I'm wrong, look at what he said in verse 13. No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. See, the master and the unethical steward or manager were serving money because they both wanted financial benefit. You and I, he says, serve God, not wealth. Love God, not wealth. So we use wealth to advance the kingdom of God. And then in verse 14, some of the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, more like the wealthy man and the unjust steward, he says in verse 14, the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things, all Jesus has just said, and scoffed at him. In other words, they thought, they scoffed at Jesus teaching about money. What is your reaction? Something to think about. And then, starting down in verse 19, Jesus tells this famous story of the rich man who died and went to Hades, went to hell, and Lazarus, who was a poor man, a beggar at Abraham's bosom, who died and went to Abraham's bosom, went to heaven. And we don't have time to develop all of that story, but here's a contrast. This story fleshes out the selfishness of saying it's my money and I'll do what I want to with it, and not invest it in the kingdom. The wealthy man here did not do anything to alleviate the suffering of the beggar who was laid at his gates. And so when I read this whole chapter and put all of this together, it just really jumped out at me that my resources and your resources really don't belong to us. They're God's, and we're stewards, we're managers. And we need to be shrewd in how we use them, by using them to advance the kingdom of God. In other words, if I, as a believer, and my resources are from God, but I use them for myself, and I don't really care about using them for God's kingdom, then I'm more like the unethical steward or manager, and the Pharisees who scoffed at Jesus' teaching, and the rich man who let the poor man die at his gate. But if I'm shrewd as a disciple, I realize that what I have is God's, and I use it to make a difference. I use it in His kingdom. I'm generous, and I tithe, and I give. And I really think one of the reasons, and there's many, but one reason tithing is a principle for us as disciples is because it protects us from ourselves. It protects us from ourselves and from becoming selfish. And so it's a spiritual discipline, if you will, that helps us stay healthy. And that's a good thing. That's a really, really good thing. So if you're not a giver, a generous giver, a tither, think about it, because that's what this chapter sure does talk about. I'll see you tomorrow as we look at chapter 17. God bless you, everybody.